Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Security Studies. We are just barely 2 weeks away from the elections in Mozambique, and one of the questions that I imagine has been on a number of people's minds is whether or not the Mozambican elections finally will be free and or fair. I am Otilia Ana Maunganidze, and I head special projects here at the Institute for Security Studies. I'm no expert on elections or on Mozambique, and so to talk us through the prospects for Mozambique, we have three people who are very well versed not only in Mozambican politics and elections, but also generally around the theme of elections, around human rights in the region, and generally in terms of what goes on in Southern Africa. Our presenters are Liesel Loh-Waldron, who's a senior researcher here at the Institute for Security Studies, a consummate professional and journalist who has worked across the African continent, as well as in France, covering African issues for many years. And then Zenaida Machado, who works for Human Rights Watch, the Africa Division, as a researcher and a media expert, and is currently focusing on Mozambique and Angola, having previously worked for the BBC. And finally, Ericino de Salema, a Mozambican journalist and human rights lawyer who currently directs the Mozambique Country Office for the Electoral Institute of Southern Africa, and has previously worked with IBISA, Oxfam, as well as Plan International. So I think we, between the three of you, you can help us answer this really difficult question, right? Which is, Mozambique has gone through years in terms of political strife and difficulty, challenges just in terms of setting up these elections and getting things going. But now they're here, or at least we hope. The preparations are well in the final stages, so we're looking to the elections. Liesel, I'm going to turn to you first because you've just written a really good report on Mozambique and reflecting on the Mozambique elections going forward, but also in the past. So Liesel.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Talia, and welcome everybody. This is a really important seminar. I think many people have been looking forward to more information about these elections coming up. It's a key event on our African calendar this year, actually. I want to start off by just noting this previous report that we did in 2017, mid-2017, where we looked at the socio-economic challenges in Mozambique. It was done by our African Futures Department. And it is very interesting that Mozambique has deep-rooted structural challenges. For example, it is amongst the bottom 10 of countries on the UNDP development list. 22% of adults went to primary school. I mean, there are real issues that Mozambique has been grappling with for a long time. And this study actually showed that with some interventions by the Mozambican government, for example, investing in agriculture, education, reproductive health, etc., the government by 2040 can make huge difference in the lives of especially the poor people in Mozambique. Poverty can be reduced by 4 million fewer people in Mozambique by 2040. These interventions are done. That is the best case scenario. So what does that have to do with the elections and the situation now is that we can't afford any instability, any political strife post-conflict. The Renamo government peace deal has to stick if things are going to improve in Mozambique. In our SADC region, that is one of the countries that are really troubled because of these, as I say, underlying things. This report also looked at the natural gas finds, the natural resources, because it was produced in mid-2017, as I said. The predictions are that Mozambique is going to grow by over 9%. Okay, it has taken a dip these last couple of years since the hidden debt was discovered in 2016. And even this year, the growth rates are around 3%. So, but from 2024 onwards, there is that prediction that the growth is going to increase. I'll come back to that briefly. But the study shows that even with the income from the natural gas, which will be billions according to the government, it is still crucial to have that stability. We can't afford anything to go wrong with these very tense elections that are really taking place in a complicated context for the ruling party and for the country. And our guests will definitely look at that in more detail. So just a final word on the report is that it was produced before news of the instability and the insurgency. I don't know, colleagues, how you describe the violence in Cabo Delgado. From what we know now from our recent research, there were signs from 2014, 2015, and the first attacks in August 2017, but the research community and so on outside of Mozambique actually only took note by November 2017. So that's an added issue on the threats we are sort of facing. Just on that, Zenaida will touch on it. In my recent report that has just come out, I also address the various scenarios around that violence. But as the ISS, we have commissioned various studies. One will be published in the next few weeks. Researchers went to the area and had some really interesting revelations. And with another of our ISS divisions that look at cross-border Willem, help me. Transnational crimes, thank you, and counterterrorism. We are embarking on some real in-depth field studies. So we'll be going forward, maybe be able to also contribute more. So basically, that's the broad context. And in the few months ahead of these elections, as I said, and that's really the core of this recent paper, is to say the elections are taking place within a context where you have all these various elements sort of coming together. We had the August peace deal. There are internal divisions within Renamo. Interesting for us as outsiders is that in terms of our foreign policy, South Africa really was absent in these negotiations. We see ourselves as a peacemaker and a mediator on the continent in places like Lesotho and Madagascar and so on. But it was other actors, the Swiss ambassador and others that were involved there, which is interesting. But I'll leave that to Zenaida to look at. So that's the one issue, the internal divisions, and then a real threat of violence there from the breakaways from Renamo. The other issue is, for the first time now during these elections, the new electoral laws in terms of decentralization are going to come on board, which I think Ericino will enlighten us a bit more about. But that was the key demand by Renamo all these years, since 2013, 2014. I remember those elections where the big complaint of Renamo was that we win the majority in a province, in one of the 10 provinces, or a number of them, and yet the provincial governor is parachuted from the central government. And so now for the first time, voters will be able to vote for a list for provincial assemblies. The provincial assemblies will have a bit more power than before, and that is going. So this is going to be a real test for Mozambique's democracy and decentralization. The third point is the other changes to the electoral system. I think from what we saw in terms of field research earlier this year was that local observers are really upping their game, tens of thousands of them actually on the ground, and for the first time, or they've observed the registration process, which also revealed some anomalies and some serious concerns in terms of how free and fair the elections are going to be. So the fourth issue is the insurgency, which I won't speak about more. The hidden debt of over $2 billion is it's an underlying issue that has various consequences on the growth rate, on confidence in the capacity of the government, but also what we've picked up is the government is very hesitant to have revelations about this, and civil society organizations have been, under threat in a way, I would say, some of them. I mean, Mozambique has got a long history of crackdowns at times, against media freedom, but this whole context and the insurgency as well has contributed to that atmosphere where media, researchers, civil society have been prevented from speaking out about certain issues. Another issue is the big focus on the natural disasters we've had this year, the 2 cyclones, and the question whether humanitarian aid will be politicized. There have been some reports of that in the run-up to the elections. And then finally, the context that I would just like to sketch is this massive gas production. And the huge expectations and the dangers actually around those expectations. I quote the President, Filipe Nyusi, in the report where he says, at the signing of the $25 billion Anadarko contract in June this year, he said that with this project, the peasant children will become doctors, the children of miners, lawyers. We are talking about 45,000 people indirectly that will be employed. So huge expectations. During the election campaign, he also has now spoken about some of the capital gains tax, because there's now a transfer of some of the deals between Total and Anadarko and so on. Those of you who have been following that in detail. So he was saying during the campaign that $880 million is now coming into the pockets of the Mozambican government thanks to this latest deal. And then, interesting, he said that so $97 million will go for the election costs, $355 million for losses to the cyclones and grants to rebuild, $194, so almost $200 million to pay off debt. And that's what civil society is so concerned about. There was this corrupt deal between top government officials, bankers from outside the country, and now ordinary Mozambicans are going to, are still paying off that debt. And then he said, so some money is left into the state budget, but then he also said that some of the other capital gains from a further deal was already used to rehabilitate the north-south highways, another $100 million to pay off debt, etc. So that has been part of the campaign. It's raised huge expectations, but as I say, our forecasts show that actually structural problems, the poorest of the poor in Mozambique are not really going to benefit. So just to end off, we will have plenty of time for discussion. From what we see from observing outside, the election campaign has been tense. There have been a couple of issues that I think my colleague will highlight. I spoke about the rigging issues, but some opposition leaders have been blocked from campaigning in certain areas. Abuse of state resources by the incumbents. Insecurity in the north, of course, is likely to prevent people in Cabo Delgado from actually going to vote. Party-to-party violence that Zenaida will also look at. But the assessment in the end, I think, is that these local observers, as I said earlier, will have really upped their game. They seem to be doing better and better at every election and paying very close attention. There will be international observers, but they will be key in highlighting really, and they've already been very important in terms of highlighting the issues with the registration. And the predictions are that Frelimo will win by a narrow margin, but I will leave it up to Ericino to talk more about his predictions. Thank you.
Thank you, Liesl. I think I'll turn to you, Zenaida, because, or Ericino first. In terms of sort of your reflections, obviously the work that you do with the Electoral Institute looks specifically at these processes and a lot of the context that Liesl has mapped out. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Some 5-6 talking points. I'll start by the contest. Well, one, to understand the ongoing electoral process has to also call into attention the overall context in which the things are happening. Okay, immediately after the sworn in of Mr. Philippe Nyusi as the new head of the state, tried to have some agreements with Mr. Afonso Dhlakama, the late president, leader of Renamo, and they agreed, for example, that Renamo was to draft a decentralization law and channel it to Parliament for consideration. But that law was not considered due to the vote of Frelimo, which is the majority party in the Parliament. That law actually was, let's say, re-edition of a draft bill from 1993, which was instituting decentralization in all the then 128 districts in Mozambique, meaning that if that law was in place, then Mozambique would have had its first district elections in 1994 as part of that law. But that law was considered unconstitutional and then taken out of the Mozambican jurisdictional order after 1 year after its approval. Only after almost 20 years, the country approved, not 20, almost 11 years, the country approved the constitutional revision, under which the country introduced the election of what we call provincial assemblies, but with something very strange. An assembly at the provincial level elected as part of the 2004 constitution, but with the provincial governors, something equivalent to premiums in the South African system, not being elected but still being directly appointed by the head of the state. And there are some problems with this in terms of the logic. Some of the provinces, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, sometimes 5, in our elections, were won by Renamo, the opposition party. But even though I'm talking about provinces like Zambezia, Sofala, Nampula, sometimes Niassa, sometimes Tet, even though the head of state, who is a leader of the ruling party, was the one entitled to appoint the provincial governors, even in those provinces in which Frelimo, his party, lost the elections. Okay, so which is somehow problematic when we come at least to logic. So Renamo had been asking for the change in our system since then, but there was no positive moves as part of that. So after the 2014 election, and after the failure of that the tentative agreement between the two parties, the leader of Renamo decided to undertake, let's say, a sort of quasi-war. Renamo initiated a quasi-war aimed at contesting the elections of that year. Okay, and as a result of that, the government, led by Mr. Nyusi, was forced to negotiate. And lastly, by February last year, an agreement between the parties were made public. And as part of that, the country again embarked on a constitutional revision, some amendment, as to allow the country to elect provincial governors. So for the first time, as a result of the June 2018 constitutional amendment, this year, in 2 weeks, for the first time, the country will be electing provincial governors. What does this mean in actual fact? It means that although the powers of the provincial governors are somehow mitigated, as there will be a new figure in the system called provincial secretary, with almost a couple of executive powers, while the provincial governor will be just, let's say, will be having symbolic powers. At the end, as someone who will be elected, will have legitimacy. And having legitimacy, it will be an issue for the overall, we think, overall credibility of the ruling party, even in those provinces where it will be having, let's say, it will be in the opposition, but calling the shots through that strange arrangement, administrative arrangement, via that provincial secretary. So, as part of that, this election will mean really loss of power from Frelimo, as it is expected or anticipated that at least 3 to 5 provinces will be won by the opposition, meaning that the opposition will be having provincial governors for the first time in those provinces that it had been winning since the first ever election in 1994. So this in part explains the current violation in our election, but Zenaida will detail those issues. But in our point of view, the fact that for the first time the formula of the power will change due to this change in the legal framework is something which is very problematic, and in the culture of Frelimo, this one may be explaining the violence which is ongoing in the country. Another issue are internal dynamics, not only in Renamo and provinces like Cabo Delgado, but also within Frelimo. Okay, Mr. Nyusi is not, let's say, a president who is supported by all the members of Frelimo. There are some factions within Frelimo which are not in favor of Mr. Nyusi, and some actions is taken in relation to the then hidden debts. Okay, even increasing the opposition that he has from some factions within Frelimo. Okay, and the fact that he allowed the election of provincial governors, meaning that the real loss of power will be there for the first time. Some Frelimo factions are saying that Mr. Nyusi has given almost half of the country to the opposition. Because in terms of logic, even if hypothetically elections will be rigged, let us say, it is not possible that for the first time Frelimo wins all the country. While since 1994, that was not the situation. At least 3 to 5 we anticipate the opposition may be winning. And within Renamo, there are also issues. After the agreement, between the peace agreement, by 1st and 6th August this year, signs of emergence of a military junta became to be visible. That military junta, so-called military junta, is led by someone who calls himself General Nyong'o. There are some issues of some military attacks in some provinces of the, in some central provinces of the central region of Mozambique. But even though General Nyong'o, who is the leader of the so-called military junta, is refusing that is the one who is behind those attacks. So, if it is not him, then the question is, who is undertaking those attacks? Is there another invisible force which may eventually become the third military, let's say, group one day in the country? That is the question which the future will still be answered. Coming into the 2019 elections, well, for the first time we are going to an election in which the existence of issues in the process has been substantiated. Okay, in the past, Renamo used to say that there are issues with the voters registration, voters rolls, lists, etc., but without substantiation, without evidence. But for the first time this year, there is massive evidence of issues in the voters roll. Why? For the first time in our history, the registration, the voters registration was observed from the very first day up to the very last day in all the districts. Now the country has 161 districts, okay? And this has been observed systematically through an electoral software called the Popola, which is an ASA software, and ASA is working with civil society organizations in this, including the Catholic Church of Mozambique. And for those who don't know, in Mozambique there are places in which you will not even find the state, but you will find the Catholic Church. So this one explains strategically the relevance of the Catholic Church in Mozambique. So with these issues in the voters registration, a very small province constituency, which is Gaza, the only province in the country in which the opposition has never elected a single MP. Okay, the number of seats in the parliament almost doubled. Okay, from 14 to 23, and there is no scientific explanation for that. Okay. It was the domestic observers who firstly highlighted this, saying that it was strange that the level of effort of the voters registration officers in Gaza were very low when compared to those of their colleagues in provinces like Zambezia and Nampula, which are now strongholds, the opposition strongholds, meaning that Gaza had much more officers for voters registration than Nampula and Zambezia, okay, which was found to be very strange. Second, according to CNN, the Gaza province constituency was the only one in the country with 80% of adults, meaning that in the total of the population, Gaza was the only province which would have 80% of voters, while the average in the country was around 50 to 55. And the explanation was that no, Gaza has very few children, just adults. But before the end of the voters registration, the then head of the Stats Institute, the Institute of Statistics, wrote to CNN saying that no, your information is wrong. What you are saying to be true for this year will be due by 2040, not now. Okay, so please correct that information. The real data is this. But even though the Electoral Commission ignored that warning, it moved in that line until by July, the Stats Institute called a press conference in which publicly it exposes that there were issues in the Gaza voters registration. So why the Gaza registration is relevant for this election? First, when one compares the aggregated data of local elections in Mozambique, every local election which was not boycotted by Renamo, we've had so far 5 local elections. Renamo has boycotted 2. And every time there is an election, a local election, which is not boycotted by Renamo, when we aggregate that data and we compare to the data of the election, general election in the very following year, for example, 2013, 2014, 2018 last year, 2019 this year, 2008, 2009, local elections 1 year, general elections the following year. The popularity of Frelimo decreases in almost 4% from a given local election contested by Renamo to the following general election in the coming year. So last year, when one aggregates the data, the results of the local election in 53 municipalities, Frelimo won with 51.5% of votes, meaning that if this tendency is maintained, for the first time we will have a parliament in which Frelimo will still have a majority, but not an absolute majority, just a simple majority, meaning that hypothetically, opposition together will have more than 50% of the votes, meaning that it will be very difficult for example, if Mr. Nyusi wins the election, it will be very difficult for him to govern without having a majority in the parliament. Okay, but let us underline this. With the Gaza changing the number, even with the maintenance of this tendency, it means that Frelimo will then win the election with 50.5 to 51% because of the situation of the change in the seats in Gaza from 14 to 23. Okay, so I personally suspect that this issue of the Gaza was not accidental. It was something which was prepared. The motives, I don't know. It's not part of my business to find out. But I suspect that given the fact that even if this tendency is kept, Frelimo will still have absolute majority, 50 plus 1 in parliament, with this change in the Gaza province. But without this change in Gaza province, and with the maintenance of this average of 4% loss in popularity from a given local election to the general election the following year, it would mean that for the first time, Frelimo would technically go to opposition. Technically, because without having 50%, an absolute majority in parliament, you cannot govern. Your budgets, your plans, etc., will not be approved. You cannot revise the constitution, etc., etc. So I think this one is something which explains in part the issues with the voters registration. Not only Gaza. Gaza is where the scenario is chaotic, but generally in all the provinces there are issues where Frelimo is popular, increase in 2-3 seats. Where Renamo is popular, a decrease in 4 to 5 seats. But Gaza was the province in which the manipulation of the voters registration was very visible for anyone who wishes to have an independent analysis to the situation. So we are going to an election for the first time, as I said, with evidence of issues in the process. CNA was called to undertake or to consider an audit to the voters' roll. This has been the case in countries like Zimbabwe, Mauritius, Kenya, etc. It's something which is possible to do in 10, 15 days. Firstly, our independent electoral commission was saying that it has no money to do it. But after that public declaration, a certain civil society organization called CIP, Center for Public Integrity, wrote to CNA saying that we've got a check for you. We can do that that audit. And then CNA replied after some 20 days saying that unfortunately there is no way because Renamo lodged a complaint in the Attorney General office, so cannot allow it while there is a criminal investigation ongoing. But what I personally found in my investigations is that there is a ruling from the Constitutional Court. We call it Constitutional Council, but in actual fact it's Constitutional Court. There is a ruling from 2013 which says clearly that in such a situation it is the obligation of CNA to undertake an investigation to clarify the issues. This is the first time I'm saying it has never been said in Mozambique, but I found it, I've got that ruling saying that in such a situation it is the obligation of the EMBs, mainly the Electoral Commission, to investigate so that the credibility is not undermined ab initio, meaning as from the beginning of the process. But the fact that the CNA refused means a lot in what this election will be. So it is very easy to anticipate that adding to the ongoing pre-electoral violence, the situation after the elections is very difficult to predict, because for the first time the political geography of the country may change substantially, and that change may even lead some interested parties to some confrontations. As you know very well, almost one in each every 3 elections in Africa is marked by pre-election violence. And those who undertake mainly pre-electoral violence are the ruling parties. But post-electoral violation is mostly undertaken or conducted by opposition parties due to the fact that the results, in their opinion, do not reflect what was the will of the voters, okay? And according to studies undertaken by ASA and other electoral organizations in Africa, in countries where the judicial is independent, after the ruling comes out from the courts, the situation becomes calm because people believe in the courts. But in countries, unfortunately, I have to say this, like Mozambique, where no one believes in the courts, it is very, very difficult to believe that a ruling from a court would make things become normal. So the exception in Africa are 4 or 5 countries in terms of credibility of the courts, which, when we come to elections, which are South Africa, Namibia, Ghana, Kenya, and Botswana. Yeah. So for now, I think I'm done. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Erisino. I think you helped at least me, but I think also people in the room get a clearer picture in terms of the context and the dynamics around leading to the elections, and perhaps a lot of us, I imagine, will be looking very closely at the election results in Gaza, for example. Zenaida, over to you.
Thank you so much, Atilia. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to listen to us. It's always important to have that context that Ercilius just gave us. Again, like he explained, to understand the level of violence we are seeing in the Mozambican elections. There is a lot at stake. The evidence of manipulation of numbers, the fear to lose elections from the side of the ruling party, and the confidence of and eagerness that we are seeing on the opposition, so that finally they'll be able to rule their own people, or they'll be able to rule those who they believe have supported them over the past, let's say, 20 years of
25,
elections,
yeah.
25 years of elections in Mozambique. I think at this stage it's safe for us to say that this 60 Mozambican general elections is on track to be one of the most violent that we have ever seen. We are not being the prophets of doom here. We are just laying down bluntly what is going on as we speak. We at Human Rights Watch have already documented cases where people most linked to the opposition Renam were attacked by people that were allegedly linked or identified or wearing regalia of the ruling party Frelimo. We'll soon publish a document on that, but let me briefly explain the context of the violence around these Mozambican elections. I'm carefully saying violation around the Mozambican election because I don't want to call every type of violence that is going on in the country at the moment election violence. And apart from the context that Ercilio gave, there is another important context and dangers as well that we are seeing in Mozambique, is that for the first time there will be elections while two conflicts are not resolved. One is the issue between the government and the Renamo forces, and the second one is the insurgency that keeps on growing, and nobody seems to understand what exactly is going on in Cabo Delgado. And then on top of that, we have what we generally call election violence, which is the skirmishes that we see happening between political parties as they campaign and seek the votes of Mozambican people. The Electoral Commission, in its first assessment of the process of the campaign, mainly 2 weeks after it started, was already concerned about the level of violence. And they were concerned about three main things. One was the destruction of propaganda material, which leads to the second concern, that is the physical attacks. Once you destroy somebody's propaganda material, the other side feels aggrieved, wants to defend his own party, and then what we see is violence. And then the third concern was the violation of freedom of assembly. In several cases, people were stopped and prevented from exercising their right to campaign by other parties, or at times, unfortunately, by security forces itself. And they also raised an important point, which was the level of violence that was going on during the campaign. And they revealed that 14 people had already died. Note that most of the people that died at that stage, those numbers have increased since, was mainly due to traffic accidents. But that doesn't necessarily exempt political parties from that problem, because most of the accidents happened because the party supporters were involved in bad driving and were consuming high levels of alcohol, to the point that police had to send officers with the truck of alcohol and make sure that they control the level of consumption of alcohol. And that happens, in my own perception, because this eagerness to get the votes is making everybody behave in an unruly manner. Everything is valid in order to get the votes before 15 October. And 29 people had been detained. We believe that if the security forces were doing their work well, many more should be in jail by now. Meanwhile, we have the issue of vehicles being attacked on roads in Manica and Sofala, in areas that we have seen previously violence by Renamo men. Yes, as you said that the leader of the Renamo military junta, as they call themselves, has denied most of the attacks, but he has claimed responsibility at least over two of them. And then on top of that, we have the insurgency in Cabo Delgado, which has already killed over 200 people. I think we have now lost count of how many people have died in the insurgency since October 2017. This insurgency in Cabo Delgado is leading a lot of people to flee their villages. I have doubts that these people will be able to exercise their right to vote. And it also is threatening to bar elections from happening in quite a few areas in at least 5 districts of Cabo Delgado. Let me quickly touch base in each one of the problems that I mentioned. One is the election violence. It's mostly characterized by attacks by groups linked to political parties on their rivals. It has been going on since the start of the election. The first serious incident took place in Moatis on August 31st, when well-identified Frelimo supporters, led by their party secretary in the region, went to the house of a Renamo member and attacked him and the wife. And in response, Renamo, and this is one of the details that is important to mention. Every election where there is Frelimo and Renamo, we tend to see those kind of extremists because Renamo sees itself as being able to face violently or to respond at the same level. And our concern, as I will be explaining as we move towards the election, is that we are getting to that stage where Renamo mainly is not sitting back, but is beginning to respond. So what happened on that specific case on the August 31st is that Renamo supporters organized themselves, went to the house of that same official, attacked the wife, and then went to the office of Frelimo and attacked that official. Ironically enough, Frelimo had a press conference to complain about that attack. Another worrying case happened on September the 5th when a teacher was beaten in the head by a group of men who invaded his house after he attended a Renamo rally. This happened in Zambezia. And he says that the people that attacked him identified themselves as being Frelimo supporters. Then on the same day, or on the same night, a group of men invaded the house of the mother of the Renamo candidate for Zambezia province governorship and set the house on fire. Luckily, the woman was not at home. The candidate has blamed Frelimo supporters for that action, and he has also expressed his disappointment to the fact that mainly the chief of the ruling party did not quickly come out to isolate themselves from the case. Then 2 days later, on September 7th, a group of unknown individuals, but you can also assume that they were linked to the ruling party, went to the house of a Renamo member in Mutarara, that is in Tete province, and set the house on fire. The family was sleeping inside. Luckily, they left unhurt, but the house was completely destroyed. These attacks I mentioned happened in between several others that included also MDM supporters and other smaller parties. And most of the time, these other little scrimmages that we have seen are caused by, again, the destruction of propaganda material. I think it's important to note here that destroying propaganda material, according to the Mozambican Electoral, is an electoral crime. But police has taken no public action that we have seen against senior party officials. Most times what they've done is to detain or arrest the supporters that are caught doing that in the act, but there's no clear investigation on what might have led those supporters to commit such actions. Was it volunteer? Was it under instruction by somebody senior? And we know of cases where those people claim to have been sent by their own bosses, party bosses, where they are. In the past week, the violence has reached a new level, where for the first time, presidential candidates are being physically attacked. In past elections, it's always been clear that that type of figure requires a lot of protection from the security forces. In this one, it's very shocking to see supporters of one party throwing stones at the convoy of a presidential candidate. Especially in the case of Mozambique, where the presidential candidates are not low-profile figures. One is the leader of the main opposition party, that's Osufu Momad, and the second one is a mayor of a city, as the second largest city. So that in itself should require special attention from the security forces. However, we have seen, for example, on September 26, the car where Osufu Momad was traveling was stormed in Angonia, that is Tete province. And then on September 25th and September 27th, the same happened to David Simango, and he was physically prevented. The crowd arrived where he was campaigning and was physically prevented from delivering his speech and campaigning and holding a rally. Police claimed that the reason why they could not protect or avoid that kind of attack was because David Simango, who is the MDM leader, did not provide them with an itinerary of where, I know it sounds a bit funny, but they did say that he did not provide them with an itinerary of where he was going to. In my opinion, the apparent inability of police to control those crowds of supporters and the violence, as well as the silence of the ruling party leadership at the top, and the absence of a strong, but very strong, that at this stage is much needed, condemnation from the Electoral Commission, is leading us to an environment that can run into chaos during and after voting. And I'm saying this because this should be the celebratory moment where there is a clear law that rules the process. And in the past, it has been mostly or highly a celebratory moment. And however, police is showing us their inability to control the violence. As we approach elections, we beginning to see that the opposition is not sitting back. Just 3 days ago, the headquarters of the ruling party in Mosoril, Nampula, were burned down. Of course, at this stage, we don't know who did it, but we can easily derive from the current situation might have happened. Then the other violence that is problematic is the one that is being created by the Renam breakaway function, or as you might want to call or prefer to call, the Renam military junta. I think Leslie mentioned, his name is, the group is led by a man called Mariano Nyongo. Nyongo was a general was very close to the late Alfonso Dhlakama, the same way Osufu Momad was. Osufu Momad is the current leader of Renam. But for some reason, Nyongo doesn't believe that Osufu Momad is the person that deserves or is competent enough to lead the party, Renam. And he has been saying that way before the August peace deal was signed, that he didn't think that Yusuf Mohammed had the legitimacy to negotiate a peace deal or to negotiate the fate of the thousands of Renamo armed men that are yet to be integrated in the society, back in the society or in the security forces. He was ignored. And in early August, Mozambique had the peace deals that was called definitive peace deal. I have problems with that word because there is, if there was no warranty in 1992 that it was a definitive peace deal that broke down 20 years later, let alone this one that happened within a very problematic environment. He wants the current leader to step down. He wants the August peace deal to be nullified, and he wants to renegotiate a new peace deal.
And the elections to be postponed.
And the elections to be postponed. And this, thank you for reminding, because that's actually the most important point, because he says that unless elections are postponed, attacks will continue. And we have already seen them happening. Notably, just a week after the start of the campaign, on September 4, vehicles were attacked near Nyamatanda district, that is in Sofala, between Nyamatanda and a bit of Manica. On September 17, there were 2 attacks on the roads that the trucks move from Zimbabwe to the Beira port. And then recently, on September 28, again, they staged an attack on a truck in Gondola, Manica province. Our position at Human Rights Watch is that this kind of environment is led by a long prevailing state of impunity that Mozambique has. Those crimes have been committed before. They are not new. I have researched on them over the years, and I'm so tired of repetition. The names of the roads are the same, the names of the districts are the same, the modus operandi is the same, the name of the leadership is the same. And yet, over the years, the country continues to insist that amnesty laws are the best way to ensure an effective and long-lasting peace. But there's no evidence that the amnesties that have been given to both sides have led to a definitive solution to the Mozambique conflict. And this is already, the one that was signed in August was already amnesty number 4. There was one in 1989 that was unilateral just for the Renamo rebels at the time. There was one in 1992 just before the peace deal for both sides. There was one in 2013 that led to 2014 that led to elections in October, and then the one that we had now in 2019 in August, which again the president claims that was in order to ensure an effective and long-lasting peace. I should note, for those who have not seen the document of the amnesty law, it's literally, it could actually fit, if you reduce the characters of the words to 10, could fit in 1 page. It's about 2 to 3 pages, the document that was sent to Parliament. And where the problem is that in none of those processes, they took into consideration some important issues that are relevant when wanting to achieve peace. One is compensation of the victims. The victims of the Mozambican conflicts have been the same people over the years. They have never been compensated. They lose and they recover things by themselves. The second point is investigation and accountability. It might lead to an amnesty law, but it's important to have that process. I think people deserve to understand who did what and why And then if at the level of society there is a general consensus that amnesty could be the best option, then be it. But accountability and investigations are very important. And then the third point, which is the one that as Human Rights Watch we have been pressing on, is the issue of assistance and help for families. A lot of people over the years have lost their relatives. They don't know where they are. They left home one day, never came back. People have not found closure. And there seems to be no interest on the side of government to help these people to find their loved ones. One of the images that stays in my head as I do this work over the years was one of the recent conflict where I visit the same family 3 times, and I could watch the way the son, the only adult, a teenager boy, now he's an adult, was evolving in terms of pain, heart, and the need to revenge. Initially, when I visit them, he was hopeful that his father left house one day because one of the brothers came and took him from the house to accompany him to Gorongosa. They went to Gorongosa, they never came back. The family tried to call the phone that went unanswered, and since then to today, they don't know where they are. They were later told that they were taken by security forces because they were believed to be supporters of Turnout. The first time I visited the family, the boy was hopeful that the father would come back. The second time, he was very angry that the state had not provided any help to them. The father was the only source of income in the house, and the mother was now being forced to go far away to farm to be able to feed the family. He had stopped going to school, didn't want to go to school anymore. The girls were more resilient and they continued until last grade. I'm very happy for that. But the third time I visited them, he was drinking. The mother didn't know what he was doing. And he spent most of his time involved in people of bad character. I'm quoting the mother. So the chances of this boy joining any other group of insurgency are very high. And that's because he has a background history on his own personal life about how the state has failed to help. This is one family. There are many others out there in Mozambique that are undergoing the same circumstances. Then the last point is the issue of insurgency in Cabo Delgado. I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing this because I really don't want our conversation to be all about Cabo Delgado. I know it's an exciting topic to everybody. It is the fact that I strongly believe that in some villages in Mozambique there will be no elections on October 15th. It's already the insurgency affecting campaigning in Muidumbi, that's a district, in Kisanga, in Nangadi, in Macomia, and Mocimboa da Praia. I want to note the specific case of Macomia, the north of Macomia mainly, because Macomia was also hit by Cyclone Kennedy, and for long periods of time was inaccessible. And if you look at how the insurgents operate, they operate along the coast. So probably they were the only ones who were actually accessing those areas, until eventually Caritas managed to get there, and now I understand Oxfam is also has reached an agreement with the government to go to those areas and deliver food. But the UN itself struggled to deliver Cyclone Kennedy aid to some areas in the north of Macomia. So a lot of people have not been able to reach those areas. And it's my understanding that those have also been some sort of informally been declared non-go areas. You can't drive down there or up there. The security force will tell you, no, you can't go there because it's problematic. They are not going to be able to protect you. In the past, since the start of the elections, in our own calculations, at least 15 people have died. I know there are reports talking about 20 or more. Several houses have been burned. Again, that's the modus operandi of the insurgencies. They burn houses. And then we are now beginning to hear reports of kidnapping, which is a new issue that we are working on at the moment. Those kinds of violations are as a result of at least 9 attacks since the start of the election campaign. At least. I'm sure there are other people that are monitoring more truly and they are able to provide more correct numbers. Some of the political parties have already desisted from campaigning in those districts, although the security forces have offered to escort them to those areas. And today, then we are how many days to the election? 12 days. The Electoral Commission has not openly or public informed anyone if they will indeed be able to hold the elections in those areas or in the entire Mozambican territory for that matter. Yes, I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Zenaida. You alluded to something that I sort of had at the back of my head, which was, one, before we get to whether the elections themselves will be free and fair, whether people will show up, and importantly, whether all the polling stations will actually be open. So before I open up for a broader discussion, Ericino, just some reflections from you in terms of, there's the violence that's been alluded to, the insurgency and all of that, from the work that you are doing. And based on past voter turnouts, looking in your crystal ball, but what can we expect in terms of voter turnout for this election? And which regions, I know you've already spoken specifically about Cabo Delgado, but which other regions maybe should we be looking at low turnouts because of the developments?
Thank you. Well, looking to places like first let me start by explaining what us as ASA will be doing in Cabo Delgado.
Yes, please.
Particularly. We will be observing the elections all over the country, and also in the election day we will be doing a PVT, parallel voter tabulation. This time with a very good sample. We've got around 7,000 observers under the PVT arrangement, parallel voter tabulation, and using this electoral software, meaning that although it's not part of our role, responsibility to say who won, who did not win, at least we will know the tendency based on our parallel voter tabulation. We will be having around 22,000 voting stations, meaning that the 7,000 is almost 1/4. 1/5 of it. So it will be very relevant to have the results and anticipate what is the tendency. In what refers to Cabo Delgado, due to the insurgency situation, we will be doing what we are calling in-depth observation, not the parallel voter tabulation, but in-depth, which means Cabo Delgado will be part of the PVT, but adding to that, we will be doing an in-depth observation, looking to 2 issues. The issue of insurgents, mainly in those 5 districts, which Zenada described very well, and also in some other districts which are covered by the extractive industry, ongoing extraction of mineral resources as we are speaking. The methodology, the instruments are different, and we will be in a position to tell in particular what was the situation in Cabo Delgado due to these contextual elements. When we come to the turnout in general, I think there are 2-3 elements which can raise doubts as to whether we will be having a good participation in this election. First, the insurgency in Cabo Delgado. Second, the issue of cyclones, Idai mainly, in some provinces of the central region, mainly Sofala and Manica, and also Cyclone Kenneth in some provinces, mainly Cap Delgado. Okay, because there are people who moved, the displaced people, and as per the law, you cannot vote outside the place in which you are registered. Okay, and so far there is nothing from CNA as to address these situations in particular. Third and last but not least, as someone who knows the Mozambican culture very well, before all that was said, I studied anthropology. I don't think that it was a good idea to table elections for a Tuesday. 15 October will be a Tuesday. Tuesday, Thursday are days in which some factions of society do what you call bridge. Okay, there are people who will go for mini holidays from Friday until Wednesday morning because of putting elections in a Tuesday. Wednesday would work, or Saturday or Sunday. This is my reading, and I will be happy if the facts show that I was wrong, because I would like to have a lot of people turning out and voting. So in terms of turnout, I think the minimum we'll have is a very small increase in comparison to the last election, due to the fact that a lot of our population is very young in comparison, for example, to the population of the Western world. This year, we'll be having a lot of 18, 90s, 20s voting for the first time. These are people who are very willing to vote for the first time, and these are people who have nothing to do with the Belgian history of Renamo, the whole history of Renamo, etc. But there are people who are participating through various social media platforms, who have got their own views, etc. I think there will be a balance at the end, but not in levels exceeding 60%. This is what I think in particular.
Thank you. And Liesl, just one question to you now, obviously with the work that you did in researching in the lead up to the elections, but also really just tabulating registrations, people's interest. Something that Zenaida said stuck in my mind, which is a lot is at stake. And as a result, you see direct attacks on individuals. You see, you see these shifts within society in terms of maybe even thinking now perhaps the governor will be from Renamo instead of from Frelimo, and what does that mean for that society? Now, to you, Liesl, I ask a question outside of Mozambique. I think we've spoken quite a bit on Mozambique now, and we will in the Q&A in a moment. But for Southern Africa, we've gone through a series of elections. Mozambique is not the only election coming up now. We've got Botswana as well. And we had Zimbabwe last year, for example, South Africa in this. A very quick response, a difficult question. But for Southern Africa, are we doing well when it comes to hosting elections and using those as a tool towards democratic consolidation?
Yes, an easy question. Thank you, Atalia. I think these elections are interesting because, as you know, we've got the former liberation movements in our region that dominate, and this scenario now that we have in Mozambique, where Frelimo is really in trouble, as I could say, or is facing its toughest test yet, is in contrast to places like Namibia, where SWAPO has actually increased its support. In the BDP in Botswana, which is not really a former liberation movement as such, but has been a ruling party forever, is now split. And we are having another discussion here on 15 October, your voting day actually, about the Botswana elections. So I think the Mozambican case would be a test, especially if, and that's a big if, that some of the other election specialists said there might be a presidential second round, which is unlikely, but that would be a test for the democracy of the country. And I really think what we've seen, issues we haven't mentioned here this morning, but using the incumbency in such a way. We've seen speeches by President Nyusi who says, well, we've built the road up to here. If you don't vote for Limo, we're not going to build the rest. Am I right? I mean, those kind of speeches saying, yes, we've planned this dam here, but you guys voted for Renamo, so we actually didn't build it. That kind of use of, state resources, which we see in South Africa as well, it shows, I would say, a lack of maturity in the democracy as such. I just want to end on one thing on the region. I find it quite tragic that we have two charismatic, long-term, brave opposition leaders, Morgan Tsvangirai and Dhlakama, who both passed away before crucial elections. Tsvangirai passed before the July 2018 elections in Zimbabwe that he might have won, and Renamo, some of the people I spoke to in Maputo said if Dhlakama was still around, this would have been the only chance. And then we have John Garang in South Sudan. So there seems to be some big tragedy on our continent if you're a long-standing opposition leader and you're almost there.
Sorry, can I make a small comment?
Yeah.
Yes, Adesina, please.
Well, Dhlakama is not there physically, but is there, let's say...
The spectre of Dhlakama.
I'm happy.
Yeah, and don't forget we're in Africa. Renamo had its best ever results in local elections last year after the passing on of Mr. Dhlakama. So this time we'll be having Osupu and we'll be having Dhlakama also. So I don't think because Dhlakama is not physically there, the situation will be easier, let's say, for the ruling party. And that hypothesis of second round, I think it is to consider.
Interesting. I think there's quite a lot in terms of discussion that we will have with our seminars here at the ISS. The first part of our seminars are public, and then we do close and bid farewell to our online audience to have a closed roundtable type of conversation, which we host under Chatham House rule. So having heard your public statements, Zenaida, Erisino, Lizo, thank you very much. I think for a lot of people you've elucidated quite a bit in terms of the dynamics leading up to the elections, but I think also reflections going forward. Whatever the results are, the issues that you've highlighted, the structural, socioeconomic issues, the violence, the lack of accountability, and effective responses to people's concerns, but also the politicking that affects the everyday lives of people are things that aren't set to a day. So yes, people will go, those who can will go and vote, but the real test and why the work that you've done, Liesl, and the work that both of you do is important is about what happens after that, and how do we sustain proper good governance, democracy, and hopefully in the future proper observance of the rule of law and human rights within Mozambique, and a criminal justice system that serves the people and not just the state. So thank you to the three of you for your patience, but also for really helping us understand what I think is quite a complicated situation. As always, because the ISS is a non-governmental organization that works with the immense aid of our donors, we are grateful to the ISS Partnership Forum, comprising the Hansaido Foundation, the European Union, the governments of Australia, Canada, Finland, Ireland, the USA, and the kingdoms of Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden, without whom the seminar would not be possible, and our two guests who kindly flew in from Mozambique for this discussion would not have been here. So thank you very much, and to our online audience, thank you for your attention, but goodbye. Gosh, I have an inclination, as I'm sure you all